welcome everybody. My name is Bob Van Brocklin, Chairman of the Oregon Transportation Commission, and I hereby call the May 14th, 2020 meeting of the Oregon Transportation Commission to order. I want to welcome all of you who are attending this morning. And I also want to thank all of you who have submitted written comments to us. Your comments are important, and we appreciate your sharing your viewpoints with the Commission and the Department, and we will consider them carefully. As you all know, we're still in virtual meeting format because of the COVID-19 virus, and therefore we're meeting in a virtual setting rather than having an in-person meeting, which I regret, and I know all the members of the Commission and all at Odot regret we're not able to meet in person, but we're not due to the governor's order, and in order to be mindful of everyone's health and well-being, we're meeting this way. We are exploring other options to this form of technology to see if we can get a little bit more so that we can look at the possibility of some additional connectivity and maybe even interactive capability. So we're exploring that. I'm hoping that, however, that we're back in person meeting soon. We're not having a June meeting, at least at this point, and so after today, our next scheduled meeting is in July, and hopefully by July we will be able to meet in person. But in any case, if we continue to have to meet virtually, we're going to try and improve that to the extent we can, the technology, and we encourage your continued involvement for those of you who are members of the public. So I think the way I'll start this is with a roll call, just so I can confirm that certain people are on who have roles in the meeting this morning and throughout the day. So let me start with the Commission. Just need to hear here or present or whatever you want to say, so we know you're on. Vice Chair Simpson.
I'm here.
Great. Commissioner Callery.
On the line.
Morning, Martin. Commissioner Brown.
Good morning.
Here.
Morning,
Here.
Julie.
Morning.
Commissioner Smith.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Director Strickler, I know you're on. Cooper, Brown, are you on?
Yes, sir. I'm here.
Okay. Coaches Perkins.
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Travis, just for drill. Okay, great. Lindsay Baker. Okay, she'll be.
Sir, Lindsay will be on by around 9 a.m.
Okay, 9 o'clock for Lindsay. Stephen Hamlin. Not quite yet. Daniel Porter.
This is Karen Criswell. Daniel's here in my office, headed back to his office, so he is on.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. So I'll count that as Karen Criswell, who is going to be a couple down on this list. So welcome, Karen. Kat Silva. Okay, Kat is not on quite yet. Mac Lind.
Yes, good morning, Chair. I'm here.
Morning, Mac. Karen Rowe.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Morning, Karen. Troy Costales.
I'm with you, sir. Thank you. Good morning.
Great. Good morning. And Jerry Bohart.
I'm here. Good morning.
Great. Good morning. So just a few comments before we turn to the director's report. And I'll try and make these fairly succinct. So today, as you all know, we're beginning a strategic planning process by the OTC and Odot We expect that process to take several months. Our goal is to identify a short set of priorities and goals and then develop a more detailed implementation plan to achieve those priorities and goals. The priorities, goals, and implementation plan will make up the elements of our 2022 strategic plan, and that planning horizon is admittedly short, a little over 2 years, but we think a good period of time for us to focus in on at this point for a variety of reasons. And we can always extend it. It allows us the opportunity in 2022 to have at least a check-in on the plan to see if we need to change things in it and then extend it for the next planning horizon. We expect to, what you have in front of you, I should say, is not written in kind of detailed formal planning language, and I'm not sure we will want it to be overly formal. It's intended to be an active document and be straightforward and clear about what our intention is. We're at the beginning of the process, and today, other than some preliminary work that's been done to get us to this day, today is essentially effectively day one of this planning process. Unlike some prior strategic planning efforts, we are trying to do this as collaboratively as possible with the commission, not only the commission, but the department itself. And we are going to be doing, indicative of that intention is that we're going to have a number of presentations from the department today and potentially others going forward that will help us to think through the content of the strategic plan and the implementation plan, both of which will come before the commission for approval. At the end of our session today, we will have an initial discussion about priorities and goals, but prior to that, we'll have the presentations I just mentioned. We may make a few initial decisions today, but we don't plan to have a final document in front of the commission for approval until August. We will be having another meeting dedicated to the plan that will, at which point we'll be looking at a more developed draft that will be at the July meeting and leading up to the July meeting, and then will be the way we're envisioning it. We will be acting on the plan in August and approving it. Our goal is to approve a plan we can implement and then implement it. And so we will follow the approval of the plan or tentative approval of it in August with receiving an implementation plan, and then we will approve the entire thing, the plan and the strategic, the priorities, goals, and implementation plan as a whole in October, perhaps in September. As always, we invite public comment as we develop the plan. And so that is the outline for today and going forward. We will modify along the way as needed. We're going to do it together, and I look forward to the work. So unless there are questions of me from the commission on the planning process or from members of Odot, who I just mentioned, or others from Odot who are on the phone, I would turn it to Director Strickler for his report. Questions for me? Okay. Director Strickler.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Chair Van Broekman, members of the commission. Yes.
Director Strickler, sorry, this is Michelle over here in Salem, but we're having technical issues at the moment with the live stream, so if you could just hold for a second, and then I'll let you know once it's ready to go. Sorry, is that okay?
Yes, that is
Sorry.
fine.
Thanks. Give me a second.
If you're just joining and wonder what's going on, we're having a short pause while we fix a technical problem.
Thank you. This is Stephen Hamlin, Budget Officer for Odot.
Good morning.
Good morning. I was having issues with logging onto my computer this morning too.
It happens to all of us. It's become more critical than ever in this virtual environment.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, this is Chris. I wonder if it makes sense for us to recess and potentially check in on the live stream issue, and then see whether or not you'd like to reopen your remarks, because I'm not sure they were picked up on the live stream, or pick up immediately following your remarks, and I can jump in. I think either one's probably acceptable. I might suggest a short recess until 9 a.m. and I will jump off this line and jump on the other and see if the streaming issue is a network connectivity issue that is statewide or if it's something more local.
Okay, why don't we do that? Why don't you, other than everyone kind of check into their email between now and 9, because if we, I think I'm going to set 9 o'clock or before to get started again. And if we can't, if this is a problem that can't be fixed, I'm not quite sure what we do here, but keep checking your email because we might be able to start before 9, in which case I'd like to do that. As soon as we're ready, I'd like to go. But let's stand in recess until 9, unless otherwise notified on your email.
And Bob, they didn't pick up any of your conversation in the beginning.
Okay.
It's been down the whole. So.
Well, that's frustrating.
Yeah, there's 91 people waiting. So.
Okay.
There are people that want to dial in, just to let you know.
So, all right. Okay. Let's see where we're at here. Michelle was sending me text. Sorry.
Sir, I will jump back on. As we take time during this break, I'm going to see if I can help figure out where the issue is.
Very good. So we'll
you,
reconvene at 9, which is only 11 minutes. Just make it 9 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So my name is Bob Van Brocklin. I'm chairman of the Oregon Transportation Commission, and I hereby call the May 14th, 2020 meeting of the Oregon Transportation Commission to order. I want to welcome all of you who are attending this morning. I also want to thank all of you who have submitted written comments to us. Your comments are important to us, and we appreciate your sharing your viewpoints, and we'll consider them carefully as we move forward on our strategic planning process. And with respect to non-strategic planning communications on matters that you've raised with us or have commented on that we're involved in. So I'm going to just confirm that a few people are on the phone who are going to be making presentations this morning, and to make sure all of the members of the commission are on. So Vice Chair Simpson. Vice Chair on? Or muted and here? Okay, I'll come back to him. Commissioner Callery?
On.
Commissioner Brown?
Here.
Commissioner Smith? Morning, Sharon. Director Strickler?
I am on, sir.
Cooper Brown?
I'm here, Mr. Chair.
Nikotros Perkins?
Nikotros is on.
Nikotros? And Travis Brower?
Here.
Okay. Just a few opening comments. As you know, today we are beginning a strategic planning process that we expect will take several months to complete. Our goal in this process is to identify a short set of priorities and goals, and then develop a detailed implementation plan to achieve those priorities and goals. So the priorities, the goals, and the implementation plan together will make up the elements of our strategic plan. We purposely identified a relatively short planning horizon for this initial plan, only a little on 2022 as we expect to review the plan beginning in 2023, and that plan may be a little longer, running 3 to 4 years. To begin the process and promote an open discussion rather than by language, we have developed a short list of priorities and goals to provoke discussion and allow us to think through this at the commission with the help of the department. So we're not focused on final language or even first rewrite language. We're trying to settle on a short number of priorities and goals, and then begin to build out the plan from there. So we're beginning the process today, which is effectively day one of the effort. Unlike some prior strategic planning efforts by the OTC, we are trying to do this in as collaborative a manner as possible with the department, who will have significant responsibility for its implementation. Today, we are going to hear a number of presentations from Odot personnel that will help the commission provide and the department develop a common basis for developing the plan, and we may have additional presentations throughout the process. At the end of today's session, we will have an initial discussion about priorities and goals as our last segment, and we may make a few initial decisions, but we plan to have, as I say, a final document to discuss, not have a final document to discuss and approve until August. I want to thank the director, the assistant directors, and others who have been involved in initial discussions about the process that has led up to today's session. As always, we invite public comment as we develop the plan. We appreciate input and will certainly consider comments that are provided. Our goal is to approve a plan that focuses on among the highest priorities of the commission and sets a strategic direction, and a plan that we can implement and do implement in a timely manner. So unless there are questions from the commission, I think I will turn it over to Director Strickler for his Director's report. Questions of me? Okay. Director Strickler.
Okay, thank you, sir. Good morning, Chairman Rockland, members of the Commission. For the record, my name is Chris Strickler, Director of Odot. My remarks will be brief this morning, part to try and get us a little bit of scheduled time, but also I want to make sure that we have time to get to the meat of the conversation, which is really the Commission having a dialogue around the priorities that the Chair just described. As we look to the meat of today's meeting, as well as future discussions for workshops for the Commission, as well as work planning efforts that feed into that strategic plan that the Chair mentioned, my note to the Commission is simply this. This is our starting point. We really appreciate the collaboration and agree with the approach of really a combined strategic plan that is simple, implementable, and something that creates tangible results. We have expectations upon us, not just of the agency, but also of the Commission and the agency combined. And we think aligning a strategic plan that really helps to look forward at the transportation goals that we're trying to achieve. And it's really important that we start that effort really with a conversation around priorities and what we plan to do as we go forward, especially as we start to look at strains on budgets and other things that we will go through today. A good portion of today will be background and context setting, some of the information that we think is really important for the Commission to understand as the Commission deliberates on ongoing priorities and goals. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll probably comfortable.
Great. So we do have as item C on the agenda just a quick more comment than a discussion. And Chris, feel free to weigh in. And as we're going through the day, let me mention that we need to be conscious that people are listening to us rather than seeing us, and therefore we need to continue to identify ourselves as we go through the day. So again, this is Bob Dan Brocklin, Chair of the Commission. This segment is Chris, one you and I are sharing, but I just make a brief comment on the on communications and policy development. As we with respect to policy initiatives, as we go through the planning work, we may identify the need to develop proposals to other governmental entities, whether it be the legislature or the executive, the governor's office, or partnering governments in order to implement our plan. So I just mention that because that's something we ought to be bearing in mind. We're not doing this in isolation. We're doing this and need to be doing the planning and the implementation in a manner that is connecting with other the partners of ours, both in government and beyond government, in order to be making good decisions and making sure we can implement. But the policy initiatives in particular may require the involvement of other governmental entities and particularly the legislature and the governor. So I just want to put a placeholder on that. It's not called out in the document that we're going to be looking at today, which is a discussion document, fairly succinct. But it is sitting there clearly as something we need to be thinking about, because there are pieces of the implementation of this that will require intergovernmental cooperation and others that will require intrastate agencies or legislative or executive involvement and leadership. The other thing is with respect to communications, and there the Commission and I this is something that I think is a continuing interest of the Commission, which will be confirmed in the course of the day. But I think it's fair to say the Commission desires an active communication strategy around our strategic plan and other actions and involvements that other things we're involved in, and that active communication strategy involves trying to ensure that as we're taking actions and as we're completing elements of the plan, that we're ensuring that we're communicating about them so that people know what we're doing. And that is maybe a little bit different than communication style we've had on occasion in the past. And so we just need to be more conscious of communicating effectively with our partners, stakeholders, the public, and others, clearly the legislature and the governor, to ensure that what we're doing is that it's clear what we're doing and why we're doing it. So with that, Chris, if you've got additional comments, Director Strickler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just briefly, from me, is really more of a summary of what I believe we are hearing and some confirmation from myself and the agency that we are hearing. As we start to talk about priorities going forward in a combined strategic plan between the OTC and Odot, it's really imperative that we identify those areas where we have to create policy or create initiatives or support those initiatives that come forward, and then communicate those as you just described. I've heard clearly that we are in search of an active communications effort and communications plan to really be proactive in the things that we are working on, the things that we are doing, but also dynamic enough to respond to the needs of our customers. And that's been a clear message from the Commission, I believe, as well as some of our efforts that we've been working on, which is recognizing that customer base is the traveling public, providing choice, providing access, recognizing our role in reduction of greenhouse gases, and what we can do as far as implementing actions as we move forward with our strategic planning efforts. So, Mr. Chair, I guess my message is thank you for that guidance. Members of the Commission, thank you for that guidance. We hear you and want to continue to work on that active communication effort as we go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Director. And unless there are comments from the Commission, we'll move on to item D. Questions or comments? Okay. Mr. Brown, delegations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. Good morning, everyone else out there. This item is item number D. It's the delegation recommendations. There was an attachment in your packet. I'm hoping that you all have that in front of you. If you're able to pull that up, I think that'd be most helpful as we walk through this. The attachment before you is really following up on what we heard from you at your last OTC meeting in April, specifically on the desire that we heard you all voice to spend your time and energy setting the department's vision and strategy, as opposed to spending your limited time really bogged down in some of the operational details that the department is capable of handling. So as you'll recall, in April, you made a decision to up the STIP thresholds, and it was really with this idea in mind. These are similar ideas and recommendations that we have as a department that we think fit in that category. I guess I'd say we recognize that you might want to have more discussion around some of these items. And as discussed at the last OTC meeting, we do recommend that the delegations in general and these kind of procedures be revisited on a regular basis throughout the year. And it sounded like you all agreed with that. We heard from you in April that you want to at least revisit this topic after your July workshop to ensure roles and responsibilities are aligned after deciding on the combined strategic plan that was just mentioned. And so that would be a great time for us to bring back any of these items that you want further discussion on if we don't get there today. So I just flagged that for your awareness. I guess I'd also flag for you that we envision bringing back in July or August, after you've had your workshop, another set of procedural recommendations really around ODOT programs and what specifically comes before you as a commission, as opposed to what you're comfortable allowing us to manage, but really be more ODOT program focused to make sure we're looking consistently across the programs, because to date it's been somewhat different depending on the program as to what gets brought before you. But for today, the 11 items before you are the ones we think really warrant a revisiting. I'll give you a couple more caveats before we dive into the items. First and foremost, I think it goes without saying, and this was a topic last time we had this conversation in April, obviously anything at any time can be elevated up to the OTC and the director and other leaders within the department. Certainly we'll keep that in mind, and obviously you all can raise anything up that you want to see and have a fuller conversation about, regardless of authority or current procedure, if so desired. Some of these items, 3 out of the 11, I believe, actually don't change authorities, and they're really just, they're updating our procedures that were based on past preferences of either individual commissioners or just the way that former ODOT leadership like to do things. I would tell you we've used a lens of risk management to arrive at this list. We've been very mindful of not wanting to be taking everything to the OTC for action. We see that as kind of a risk avoidance approach, and it's not where we want to be. We vetted all these recommendations with our DOJ colleagues, and they don't see any legal issues with them. So with those caveats, I'll turn to the actual matrix before you, which again has 11 items on it, and speak briefly to those. If you'll notice items 1 through 4, those are really about plans. They're about big statewide transportation policy plans like the OTP, all the way down to modal plans like public transportation, to more locally focused plans like interchange area management plans, the IAMPs, all of which require formal action to adopt or approve. All these plans also at times need to be amended. There's also generally a public involvement component with all of these plans. In the past, we've relied heavily on the OTC meetings to serve as those public opportunities for comment. What we're requesting here in general is to delegate those things to the agency to manage and take action on. So we'd still have a public process. We'd still take in feedback and input and ensure that there's transparent decision making, just without using the OTC meeting time for all those items. Now, some things, of course, will be significant changes to existing plans or policies, and those would still be brought before you as the commission for your dialogue or decision making as needed. So I guess the minor plan amendments really, to my mind, that might be a question that you're wrestling with, is what are those minor plan amendments? Really what we're talking about here are the technical adjustments or corrections that carry out the administrative, operational, or management functions of the highway system. So typically these would be changes that don't have significant policy implications. They're minor classification impacts. They're local state system impacts with really not much of an impact on the overall state system. So that's items 1 through 4 in a nutshell. Turning to 5, 6, and 7, I'd characterize these really as being about the transportation system and how it's managed. Historically, a lot of these items have come before you, but hasn't gotten a lot of discussion by you all at the commission. So these are either steps the agency needs to take to manage the system, like designating a new highway when it's built, for instance, Highway 62 Expressway in Southern Oregon or the Newburgh-Dundee Bypass in the Willamette Valley, or they're more administrative in nature. For example, agreement with the city on how they'll manage the highway system through their downtown within a statewide transportation area, or entering into a jurisdictional transfer with the city or county as they take over a section of a highway. So that's the type of things we're talking about here that would be delegated down to the director. Items 8, 9, 10 all have to do with grants. 8 is about distributing federal funds to MPOs on a yearly basis, something that we feel we can handle without without OTC engagement. What we're not talking about here is the formula for distributing those funds. That would, of course, still reside squarely with the commission, and that'd be something we talk about with you all if changes are needed on that at any time. Number 9 is about those funding programs that distribute funds outside of the big selection cycles, what we typically call the discretionary grants. We would still bring those big selection cycles decisions themselves to you all, but really the in-between stuff would be what we're talking about here. And we would take advantage of being able to make decisions about funding immediate needs without having to come to the commission for approval. So a good example would be the Safe Routes to School program, where the big selection cycle every few years would still come before the commission, but the smaller grants distributed through the discretionary program or portion of the program that fall in between, those would be handled and approved at the agency level. One thing of note is this is not intended to include stiff discretionary program grant awards. Turning to 10, pretty straightforward. We see, well, we certainly don't want to get bogged down or slowed down in applying for federal funds as long as it's a straightforward process. And so we'd ask that you kind of give us the approval to do that. Number 11 is about right-of-way acquisitions. As you are all well familiar with, every month we bring you a right-of-way resolution to acquire property, mainly for improvements along our state highways. That authority allows us to use all the tools available to us, up to and including condemnation, to acquire property when needed. Now, we try hard to only use condemnation as a last resort. Sometimes it's needed, though, because we can't find the owners of the property, because it's maybe owned by generations of an extended family, sometimes because someone died during the negotiation process. And so in some rare cases, we use the right of eminent domain to condemn and take control of the property to begin construction. So what we're recommending here is delegating your authority to approve these property acquisitions to the director. Now, he, of course, or she, would, of course, be escalating things up to the commission when they think it's warranted. And so I could well envision some of those condemnations fitting that category. I guess I'd flag also here that we want to purposely change our approach to how we handle right-of-way acquisitions. The way we handle it was identified in the 2019 audit on right-of-way processes for the department. And this change that we're proposing supports the other efforts we're taking to improve our project delivery process and performance really across the board. I think it sets the right kind of incentive structure and forces us to focus our attention on getting those key elements right instead of perhaps relying on the commission for those decisions. So with that quick run through, and I know it's brief, and apologies for that, that's really what I wanted to share with you. I guess as mentioned, I would remind you, we can bring back any of these if you would like for additional conversation in July or beyond. But in the meantime, I'm happy to answer questions you have on this process, on any of these items. I'll also flag for you that we do have some folks who are more subject matter experts in each of these individual items on the line who are probably able to answer some more weedy questions if you have them. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Chair and Commissioners, for any questions.
Thank you, Assistant Director Brown. This is the only item on the agenda that's an action item, for today's meeting. Questions of Cooper?
If necessary, sorry, this is Orlando. If necessary, could these delegations be amended at any time, or is this decision that we're making today, is this a permanent? I mean, how often are we going to be looking into these delegation authorities in the future?
Sure, that's a great question, Vice Chair Simpson. So the short answer is these can be amended and changed at any time if you so desire. And the thinking really, as we discussed a little bit last month, is we think it'd be prudent to have more regular kind of revisiting of some of these ways that we do business, because things are fluid with both kind of your desires, the membership of the commission, even with some leadership within the department. And so much of this hinges upon all of those factors that we think revisiting it regularly throughout the year would be warranted. But if anything doesn't work with this approach, then we can change it back at any time.
Great, thanks.
Other questions?
This is Commissioner Calorie. I have a question about how we would handle, let's envision that there is a significant federal funding program that comes out of the pandemic situation, and it's kind of open-ended. We have, there's no specific thing that comes down with the funding. How would we handle the delegation or the direction that we would provide staff on that?
So in that case, I'll give you my thoughts, and then I'll maybe turn it over to see if others have contradictory thoughts. In that case, when we're talking about something so big and substantive as a big funding package, I would think we would still be bringing that to you to have you all as part of that conversation, because that's a new element kind of into the fiscal equation that we have, and that it really would be part of a conversation that warrants commission input. So I think that would clearly not be something that we would just be deciding on in a vacuum, but be leveraging your input on. I don't know if that answers your question, and I guess I'd maybe open it up if anybody else has from Odot has anything else to add on that.
Maybe the director could comment, because I do think the scheme, Commissioner Calorie, relies upon the director making judgments. But I agree with Assistant Director Brown's comment. I think anything like that would be something we'd be talking about at the commission and would be involved in making decisions about. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Calorie, I think the way that I would address that would be, I think, twofold. One is clearly on something that's a major infusion of funding, depending upon what program it applies to, et cetera. We really do need that commission conversation and guidance to help inform funding splits and things like that, especially if it's not already prescribed by our federal partners. I think the only caveat and the second point that I would make to that is if we have some sense of urgency in, say, a significant funding source that comes in that is really intended to be pass-through funding, I might suggest kind of briefings that occur, but not waiting for the next commission meeting to get those funding elements flowing to our local partners. So that kind of dialogue. So certainly nothing moving without a conversation with the chair and with the commission, but potentially having the authority to be able to move those things so that we don't get into a timing conversation as it relates to commission meetings. Now, the other piece, frankly, is we could always call a special commission meeting at the discretion of the commission, and certainly keep those elements entirely within the commission purview. None of these efforts are intended to be something that says the agency should take control. Actually, a little bit more the opposite, to allow some of the bandwidth at the commission meetings themselves to really take some of the things that might be more day-to-day operational and put them in the agency so that the commission can work on those guidance and vision and forward-looking efforts.
Okay, thank you. That answers my question, and I appreciate your overview.
Other questions? Okay. I would be looking for a motion then on this.
I move to approve the proposed delegations to the Odot management team.
Is there a second?
This is Orlando.
Commissioner Smith, seconds.
Commissioner Smith seconds. the motion? Further discussion? Okay, if not, I'm going to take a roll call vote unless there's further questions or comments. Okay, so we'll vote now. Vice Chair Simpson.
Aye.
Commissioner Brown.
Aye.
Commissioner Callery.
Aye.
Commissioner Smith.
Aye.
And the chair votes aye. So the proposal is approved. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Assistant Director Brown, for your presentation. Appreciate it. And we will now move on to an informational item, item E. Mr. Strickler, Mr. Brower, and Ms. Perkins will lead that discussion. I hope I'm not leaving someone out here. Oh, I guess Ms. Baker and Mr. Brown as well. So it's the director and the assistant directors.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the commission, we wanted to give kind of a high-level overview of the impacts that we're experiencing so far. I think I would stress many of the impacts are still being experienced on a day-to-day basis, and changes occur as you think about just what's open, what is not open, the availability of resources, et cetera, for the overall agency. We also, as you well know, have different functions within the agency. So customer service facing functions that are direct day-to-day customer service interaction with our DMV group, for example, and then our construction services that are quite different in how we operate clearly, and none of that is new to the commission. Our hope for this agenda topic is to really give an overview and answer any questions about the current status that we're in, and maybe give a little bit of background. So our hope is to hit the impact and implications potentially on the funding that the agency has to use, but then also on our day-to-day operations and maybe what the impact is for some of our partner agencies across the state. So as we walk through this, please feel free to dive in with any questions. And I think what I'll try to do is, rather than jump around within the assistant directors and myself, I think what I'll do is I'll give an introduction, and then I'll hand it over to Mr. Brower to talk about funding implications and DMV, and then he will then hand it on down to Mr. Brown, and then down to Ms. Baker, and then from Ms. Baker to Ms. Perkins, so that you have a single person to kind of help with the flow of the conversation right now. We'll take a brief pause in between each to be able to address any questions if that works for you. I know some of the questions that we have right now that will be answered. What is the impact on funding? What is the possibility we see coming as a potential federal relief or economic stimulus package? And how do we continue to ensure public participation in this interesting time? And I use the word interesting because, quite frankly, it's a devastating time for a lot of people, and how we operate has really impacted not just the things that the agency does, but the individuals of the agency and state enterprise across the board. From an overall standpoint, most of you are probably already aware that 10 o'clock this morning, the governor is likely to announce some sense of reopening. And reopening is a phased reopening. And rather than me butcher what the different phase criteria are, I would say that a three-phase opening strategy or criteria will be evaluated by the Oregon Health Authority and the governor's office on a county-by-county basis. So as we think about the counties across the state of Oregon, we have to adapt to what that looks like for our overall customer service aspect. A few items of note. When we started early March, before the pandemic was really upon us, we had roughly 200 to 300 people on telework status within the agency. So as a reminder, the agency is about 4,700 people. So that gives you an idea of what our maturity around telework was at that time. Our IT department, our staff, and across the agency and the team of Odot really stepped into what it means to kind of shift to a different way of doing business. And we've been using the term what a new normal looks like, because going back to kind of previous business operations is probably not likely in our near term or even long-term future. But those 200 to 300 telework efforts or individuals quickly grew to something of almost 2,000 within about a week. So about a week to a week and a half, we had to stand up the ability to not just the network capacity, but individual access and et cetera. And again, I'm not an IT expert, so I won't say what it took, but I can tell you it's a Herculean lift. And so they've done a great job in responding to that. When you think about that number transitioning to telework, we then also have to think about how do we continue to staff and continue the work efforts for our construction program, for example. And so our construction program, by comparison to other states, we are one of the few that has continued our construction efforts. And I think that that is significant to the economy. And it's also significant to keeping talent within the state of Oregon, which is really important for talent and availability for ongoing work. And so it's been one of those things that our group, as well as private enterprise, so the individual contractors and the individual consultant groups that have been working within our industry, they have really stepped up to really make it possible to continue the work efforts as opposed to pausing all of those efforts. Clearly, we have seen a reduction in traffic. At one point, within the last several weeks, we saw almost a 40% reduction in overall traffic on the system. And in some ways, that is an absolute benefit to the overall environmental goals that we are trying to achieve as an agency. A significant reduction in greenhouse gas, for example. We know that transportation contributes to 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state. But the disbenefit there is, of course, the impact of the economy, and we have to be mindful of that, and we have to balance those efforts as an agency. And so we have interesting and difficult, complex times in front of us as we start to think about the impact of the economy and the impact to the overall budget of the agency and what we are and are not able to accomplish with the funding that might be available to us. So with that kind of overview and background, I think now would be the appropriate time to turn it over to Mr. Brower to start talking about funding implications and operations for DMV and commerce and compliance. But before I do, I would pause for one last statement, which is with some counties entering into phase 1 status, or at least we're anticipating that that is likely as part of the announcement coming from the governor at 10 a.m. this morning. We are actively working on plans to look at reopening efforts specific to DMV. We have a significant demand and a significant push from our customer base that is really eager to get back in and conduct their transactions. And so we'll be working with the DMV to see what options we have available to us and what the potential demand is paired with those options. And with that, I'll pause for any questions before turning it over to Mr. Brower. Okay, Mr. Brower, take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Mr. Director. I'll talk a bit about the revenue and project impacts that we're seeing around the state, and then talk about the DMV and Commerce Compliance Division operations issues. Chris gave you background on the traffic reductions that we have seen. Our economists released their semi-annual revenue forecast in early April. It was developed really early in the public health emergency before sufficient data was really available to make a firm forecast of the pandemic's impact on revenue. It was particularly difficult to forecast the duration of the economic closures caused by COVID-19. So they did their best, but they're going to update the revenue forecast in July once more economic data is available and we have a better sense of the duration and severity of the pandemic. But as you can imagine, with traffic volumes initially down about 40% across the state, the forecast shows fuels tax revenue falling significantly for several months. However, we are seeing a little bit more resilience in our DMV revenue, and motor carrier tax and fee revenues are projected to hold more steady as a result of our fairly balanced portfolio of revenue. We are not hit as hard as some of the other states. Nonetheless, the forecast does predict about a $125 million reduction in state highway fund revenue between March of 2020 and June of 2021 before returning to more normal. That sounds really large, but keep in mind that's a drop of about 6% compared to last October's forecast. Of course, that could increase significantly if the economic impacts of the pandemic extend longer than anticipated in the forecast, or if we have a double dip sort of economic impact because we have another full shutdown again in the fall or winter. So in Oregon, that money comes into the state highway fund, and so the loss of revenue will be shared between Odot and local governments who receive almost half of the state highway fund. Odot's share of that revenue that's lost is about $67 million, and most of that will reduce what we have available for our operational budget, including maintenance and operations, forces out on the road, revenue collection functions, and administrative costs. Only a relatively small portion of Odot's lost revenue, about $20 to $25 million, comes out of funds that are specifically dedicated to projects, say that HB 2017 revenue. So we expect the impact of projects to be relatively limited because most of our projects are funded primarily through bonds and federal dollars, which aren't directly impacted by COVID-19. They're set in federal and state law. Consequently, we don't currently have plans to cancel, delay, or narrow the scope of existing projects. But if we do get to that point, we will be back in front of the commission as you are the decision maker for any of those impacts on the project world. So in the world of transit, you are aware, we had a conversation last month that Congress provided a significant infusion of $25 billion to backfill lost revenue and covering costs of public health measures for transit agencies. Urban areas received funding directly from FTA. For example, TriMet received about $185 million. And then Oregon Public Transportation Division is distributing nearly net $43 million to eligible rural and inner-city public transportation providers through both the formula allocation and an ongoing needs-based solicitation. Many eyes are turning back to Congress for a potential funding package for transportation that could be essentially a follow-on to what they've already done for transit and the aviation sector. That could take the form of either a relief sort of revenue replacement package or an economic stimulus package like we had during the Recovery Act, when investments in transportation were used to stimulate a falling economy. The ASCO, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, has asked for $50 billion in immediate relief so that state DOTs can continue operating normally. And we have seen that there is starting to be some action. Just on Tuesday, the House put forward another round of COVID relief funded at about $3 trillion. And yes, I said $3 trillion. Within that amount, $15 billion is set aside for highway programs and $15.75 billion for transit. Of that $15 billion in highway program funding, Oregon would get a little north of 180-some million that would be split between ODOT and the major metropolitan regions. So the challenge is, of course, that right at the moment we are not seeing political alignment between the parties, between Congress and the White House, or between chambers in Congress on this particular proposal. Speaker Pelosi and the House Democratic leadership are pushing forward with this, but the White House has not really said a lot about this particular proposal, other than some relatively vague comments about investing in infrastructure. And Senator McConnell and the Senate leadership have been much less excited about spending so much money. They've been pushing back a little bit on the idea of including infrastructure in a COVID-19 package. So I think it's really anybody's guess whether we will see a significant investment from Congress this coming year. I'm going to turn to the Commerce Compliance Division and DMV, which are two of our customer-facing parts of the agency. Those divisions have had their operations significantly impacted. Commerce and Compliance Division went to by appointment only in its drop-in offices and has generally been able to maintain fairly normal operations. In contrast, DMV also went to by appointment only for commercial driver's license only at 6 locations after our best efforts to maintain social distancing requirements to protect customers and staff were not able to really do so. Luckily, law enforcement has issued a grace period for expired licenses and registrations, and we've seen other organizations like the OLCC has said that people can use an expired license to buy alcohol. But at the same time, we are seeing about 30,000 driver licenses and IDs expire each month, creating a very large backlog there. One thing we have noticed, though, is that more transactions in both of these divisions have moved to mail and online. Commerce and Compliance Division has seen a significant increase in online transactions, and DMV has found that its registration volume has not fallen all that much because it's by mail and online transactions have increased by about 50%. That is good for us because that is the most efficient way that we can serve our customers. It's also good for our customers. And we're really hoping that we can continue to leverage that behavior by customers in the future, that they'll learn to interact with DMV, particularly online, and that some of the things we're doing there to provide more services as part of our service transformation program will allow us to get transactions online so people don't have to go in line. DMV is now beginning developing plans for reopening. They're looking at opening up a lot of the major offices across the state by appointment only for high priority transactions starting sometime in June. We are looking now at which counties the governor has moved into phase one, and we'll be looking at how we can do a long-term phase reopening of the DMV. We know we're not going to be back to full strength for months. We'll be operating at some level of diminished capacity, but we want to make sure that we can start serving some of those high priority transactions and not build that backlog of expired licenses and registrations any higher than it already is. So with that, I will pause and see if there's any questions.
Travis, how many DMV offices again do we have in the state?
There are 60 offices. About 41 of those are the ones we would try to target for reopening. A lot of the 19 others are essentially satellite offices that are staffed part-time by staff from a larger field office.
And how many do we? I know we kept a few open when we generally shut DMV walk-in traffic down and close the offices and went essentially to online service. But I think we kept a few open, maybe 6 or 8 or something.
Yeah, we kept 6 open for CDL transactions only across the state, and those are by appointment only, because we felt it was important to ensure, given the role of the trucking industry in moving critical supplies across the state, we wanted to ensure that there were still opportunities for people to be able to get their commercial driver's license issued or renewed.
So the 41 field offices, we left 6 open, but for commercial licenses or commercial transactions only. All right?
Yep,
and
that's
maybe
correct.
by appointment. Okay. Other questions?
Yes, Sharon Smith here. In terms of the phased reopening, I assume you're looking at physical changes to the DMV offices themselves in order to provide increased protection for both our workers and the public?
Yeah, Commissioner said absolutely. So we would go to by appointment only and have protocols for allowing people in. You wouldn't be able to drop in off the street or even come before your appointment and just hang out in the DMV office. That way we'd limit the number of people there. We would have everything set up in a way that'll ensured social distancing with moving chairs around, perhaps putting tape on the floors. We're looking at and installing sneeze guards, plexiglass between our workers and the customers, and also providing non-medical grade facial coverings for our DMV employees. And of course, encouraging and directing people not to come to a DMV office if they are in any way potentially been exposed or infected. So we'll be putting all those normal processes in place to really, within an opening, make it as safe as possible.
And that, just to follow up, and just to make sure, is that already happening, or is that something that you're still in the planning process?
We're still in the planning process for much of that, but we're beginning to have the sneeze guards installed across the state. So it's really going to be a long-term process over the next several weeks as we get some of that in place. And we still are really waiting to determine which DMV offices should be opened. Given the phase reopening as the governor has laid out, we're getting more data. As of today, within a few minutes, we will know which counties are open, and that can help inform, although it may not be the final answer on which DMV office is open and when, given that this is a multi-phase process from the governor's process that they laid out.
Sorry, one more follow-up question. This is Commissioner Smith. Just wanted to make sure that you are working with our new Assistant Director Perkins on how we do this through an equity lens to make sure that we're providing service to everyone across the board.
Yep, that will be a key consideration. And as we have these conversations, we're supposed to be sitting down next week to have this discussion, and Ms. Perkins has been invited to participate in that to ensure that we can bring that perspective to bear.
Thank you.
Okay, Chris, I think continuing, sounds like, is
So,
Travis done?
Mr. Chair, this is Cooper Brown, Assistant Director for Operations. I'll pause in case Travis has anything else to add. If not, I'll just dive into a little more detail on some of the impacts to operations, both of the system and also internally to Odot.
Okay. Follow you, Cooper.
Assuming that's okay with you, Mr. Chair.
That's fine. So this is Cooper Brown, who's speaking next. Assistant Director Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioners, so I will add a few points on some of the topics that have already been raised by Director Strickler and Assistant Director Brower. And really the thrust of my remarks will be focused on impacts to the transportation system across the state, and then internally more to the impacts to our operations within Odot. So I'd start with the traffic impacts. As Director Strickler mentioned, we have seen significant reductions in traffic volumes across the state when compared to volumes from the same period of 2019. He mentioned that initially in mid-March, when the crisis began, we saw volumes go down by about 40% across the state on average. I would note and add that those volumes have remained down since then, but we are seeing gradual increases in traffic volumes every week. So, for instance, a couple weeks ago, I believe traffic volumes across the state were down about 36% from that initial high of 40. And then last week, I believe they were down to about 29%. We anticipate getting the most recent weekly numbers this afternoon and tomorrow morning, which we relay to the governor's office. And I suspect they'll be down more too, which basically equates to traffic is increasing across the state, which I think any of us can see as we go out on the streets or look out on the streets. Truck traffic volume, rather freight volume, increased initially when the crisis began in mid-March and has held relatively steady ever since, with a slight decline. Rail freight volumes have decreased much more rapidly and markedly than truck freight volumes, actually pretty precipitously. As of the end of April, total U.S. rail freight volumes were reported to have fallen by about 22.5% compared to the same period in 2019. So as Director Strickler mentioned, the upside of less traffic is less congestion. And our team has pulled some numbers on what that looks like for Oregon since the COVID crisis began. And across the state, we've seen 0.8 million metric tons reductions or savings in greenhouse gas emissions from cars and light trucks, again, since mid-March. So that really means 35% reduction in emissions from the same time period last year across the state. So pretty significant. Now, in addition to the downside of the financial impact, since so much of our revenue is based on gas tax, there's also the downside of speeding and safety concerns. So since the crisis began, we've seen speeding ramp up significantly and also impaired driving. Most dangerous and alarming is the increase in excessive speeding. So that's 30 miles per hour or more above the posted speed limit. We've seen that increase pretty dramatically. In fact, we've heard anecdotes from, from our law enforcement partners of pulling people over who are going nearly 150 miles an hour. And if you've kept up with recent media, you will have probably seen there have been several articles written on this trend and some of the accidents caused by it in the past week or two. So turning to kind of internal operations as opposed to operations of the systems, as all of you are well familiar, the crisis has caused us to have to relook and come up with creative ways on how we do business in the public-facing arena of our oversight bodies, like the Commission. We've had to change, obviously, the format of our meetings, and this includes for the Commission, for advisory groups, area transportation commissions. Obviously, none of those are being conducted in person anymore. We're having to do them remotely, either telephonically or by video. And I'd say, flag, as I think everyone, all of you commissioners are well aware, one of the chief challenges this presents is gathering public comments and information to get to you all, because one of the ways that it was done before by having folks come before the bodies and provide that testimony and comment, it isn't really an option anymore. And so that's required us to be much more proactive about setting up our agendas and opening public comment periods well before the meeting times themselves, to make sure that the public and individuals have the opportunities to submit their thoughts and comments to you all. As Director Strickler mentioned, teleworking we feel that we've had a good deal of success moving to that model, and a lot of that credit is owed to our tremendous IT folks and across the enterprise folks that have been able to really upgrade our system remarkably fast in this time. As you mentioned, 39% of Odot's workforce, last report what we had was from early this month, the 8th of May. We had 39%, 1,790 of the 4,616 employees, Odot employees, reporting that they were working remotely. So we see both in this COVID crisis, but really moving beyond it, we see this as an opportunity to continue to encourage teleworking as a way to modernize our workforce, where, particularly for those positions where it makes sense. And I think what we've learned from this crisis is that there are more positions within the department where this makes sense than we probably previously recognized. And so we've started work to look at the challenges and obstacles to continuing to strongly encourage teleworking beyond the COVID crisis. And we see the benefits of changing our operational model to do this. Really, one is we see increased employee satisfaction in general, probably, by offering more telework options. But we also recognize that it's not the ideal way for every worker and all staff, depending on individual preference. Some folks don't prefer it. But we also see moving in this direction because of that, a valuable tool for us to help in our recruitment and retention efforts, because I think, again, across the board, having that option is probably a good thing. We also recognize that potentially there's cost savings to be had in the long term if we're able to transition to more of a teleworking remote model for a bulk of our staff, or at least a good percentage of them. And this is by reducing facilities overhead expenses, again, in the long term. And then finally, this is an opportunity for us to lead by example in helping reduce congestion and carbon emissions by moving a portion of our staff to a remote model. I guess the final thing I'd say on this is there are certainly upfront costs, and we recognize that to moving towards this new model, and we'll be weighing those costs as we move forward, obviously in light of the budget realities that are confronting us. So with that, those were the issues I wanted to delve a little more deeply into. And Mr. Chair, or Commissioners, unless there's questions, I'll turn it over to Assistant Director Baker.
So are there questions? I have one. My question is, maybe it's more of a comment. It's both a question and a comment. The comment first, I do think that what you're describing, Assistant Director Brown, is on some of the benefits of telecommuting, something we should be looking at more extensively. If there are ways for us to work more efficiently with without compromising service and productivity, and get the kinds of benefits that you described, including environmental benefits and benefits in terms of employee satisfaction and other kinds of operational advantages, that we should be looking at that in terms of integrating that in longer term. And I agree with you completely. That can be a model for others that we are in and outside government in terms of how people work and how people use our system. Have economic advantages as well to keep, take a bite out of traffic congestions, for example. So there's a lot of things to think about there, and I think we ought to be thinking about them as potential lessons learned from this experience we're going through, which obviously has terrible implications and has led to a lot of led to deaths and a lot of people who are ill and their families being affected. And all of that has been incredibly excruciatingly bad. But on the upside, maybe there are some ways we can work that are smarter and help us achieve the goals we're trying to begin to set today and the priorities. And so that's the comment. The question is there discussion going on at the department about integrating some of these changes long term in terms of telecommuting?
So, Mr. Chair, yes. To answer your question succinctly, yes, definitely, and that really is the thrust of our conversation right now, is focusing on how do we not only continue teleworking through the COVID period, but really beyond, and what are those obstacles and challenges that are before us to doing that, because they're going to look different in terms of kind of really institutionalizing it. So, for instance, as Commissioner Smith asked the question about equity considerations with some of the reopening of DMV, there's a lot of equity considerations around this as well, in terms of how do we address what staff may have and what they might not have. What if staff don't have internet access? How do we address those kind of things? What are our models? What are our policies in place? So there's a whole slew of kind of long-term things that our team's working on to make sure that we're able to continue this model beyond COVID, because that's certainly the idea, because we see all these benefits long term. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and I completely agree with you that we have to look at it through an equity lens and make sure that we're not disadvantaging employees or members of the public who we serve, or other constituencies or audiences here. So, yeah, I think a thorough, comprehensive examination of that, we want to do it again in a way that's smart and is equitable and is fair, and provides options for people to work in office if that's the better answer for individual employees. But when I think about what we're trying to do on the environmental front, for example, thinking smartly about telecommuting and how people work could be and has been apparently recently, a significant positive for the environment. So it's a strategy that makes a lot of sense to be looking at. I may be missing things in my comments that are downsides. So that's why we should take a very thorough look at it. But I think in general, it's we need to be modeling the kind of thinking and analysis we want being done broadly in the state on how we work effectively and responsibly. So I appreciate the comment. Are there other questions from the commission?
I just had a quick comment just about the speeding pandemic that's taking place on the highway system, and I'm just a little. I actually experienced it several times myself, and it really bothered me, and so I was just, and I'm glad that Cooper, you're addressing it right now, because I didn't know in what capacity we inject and play a role in this. I get there's less vehicles on the road, and so people feel the freedom or need to be bold and fearless by pushing their foot on the pedal even more aggressively, and it really bothers me and concerns me just about how people are approaching just safety on the system. And so I'm just curious as to what the role we are going to play with our partner at OSP to try to mitigate some of these careless drivers on the road. I mean, quite frankly, I have way more fear for somebody who's being negligent as it relates to speed on driving any, vehicle or any type of motorized vehicle, as opposed to the COVID challenges. Personally, I mean, I just feel like there's way more risk driving alongside somebody who's careless as opposed to, somebody who's not taking the precautionary steps if I'm in a grocery store. I'm just curious about how do we have some kind of a plan or ways in which we're anticipating addressing some of this with our state partners. State partner.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Vice Chair Simpson. That's a great question. I will flag for you, there are lots of conversations around that that I know folks within the department are having with OSP in particular. I think the long and short of it is really the lion's share of addressing it, for good or bad, ultimately does rely with state police. But there are things that we're doing around the margins, including messaging, and trying to get that word out there that this is a risk, that this is something that we need to address. There's obviously, I think, I'm not 100% sure, so I'll pause if anybody knows for sure, but I think there's also a work zone, ways we're looking at how we set up our work zones that address this as well, and to take that into account. But I think the reality is, aside from continuing to flag that this is an issue, message to the traveling public that this is an issue, and working with OSP to fill the gaps wherever they identify them, that's really the approach we're taking right now. I will pause in case Troy's on the line. I'm not sure if he is.
Well, here's a just to inject real fast. Every day there's the reader boards. I forget what the technical description or name for them are, but I know in Region 1 all of them indicate or have a message say "Stay home, save lives" or something like that, and it might be worth us putting something up there that around this matter, because that is just negligence. Like that, the role that we can play in it by any means necessary. I would just urge us to figure out whether we use those messaging boards to, just to encourage people to take their time. I mean, nobody's in a hurry right now because nobody has that kind of urgency to get somewhere, and to just take into consideration, just as they would take precautionary steps, as I said, in a grocery store, if they could take those same type of steps, on our streets and our highway systems.
Totally understood, sir. In fact, Vice Chair, that was a conversation that we were having about the variable message signing and what should be our approach there. So having you weigh in on that is very helpful for us, and we'll certainly take that back and maybe change those to address that issue more head on.
Thank you, sir.
This is Commissioner Callery. My question is, as we talk about working from home, how do we address that issue in the rural areas of the state where connectivity is a real challenge? I mean, we're having connectivity issues today just with the state network. So when you talk about southeastern Oregon, northwest or northeastern Oregon, how are we going to be able to support working from home and minimizing contact for the safety of our personnel and for the safety of others?
That's a great question, Commissioner Callery. The short answer is I don't think we have all the answers to how we're going to do that, but that is certainly one of the chief areas that we flagged for further investigation and for coming back with options and recommendations on how do we address that specific issue of folks that just don't have network access. Again, it goes back to the being equitable angle. It goes back to how we devote our resources, what we're willing to cover and pay for as a department. So there's a lot of angles to it, but that is one that we've asked staff to kind of delve into with our IT partners, some of it with the state enterprise and their IT folks to get a better understanding of where those gaps exist and how we can address it. So that's one that we're hoping to untangle a little bit more and address as we move forward with a long-term vision. Does that? I know it's not a great answer because we don't have a great answer on it right now, but does that answer your question, sir?
Yes, it does, but I do have a follow-up on the issue that Commissioner Simpson was talking about. I know we rely on the state police a lot for helping us in enforcement, especially in work zones and that type of thing. But are we also reaching out to county sheriff departments and seeing how they can help alleviate the pandemic of speeding?
That's a great question, Commissioner. I do not know, Commissioner Callery, the answer to that off the top of my head, but I'll find that out and we'll circle back with you on that. It's a great point.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
So other questions for Assistant Director Brown?
Yes, more of a comment. Sharon Smith here.
Okay, Commissioner Smith.
Just, Commissioner Callery's internet connectivity in rural areas and how do we address that from an equitable basis, I think is a really good one. And it makes me consider, and we all ought to be thinking a little bit broadly now that we have an opportunity to think of things differently. And in my mind, internet connectivity and the ability to communicate is becoming almost an essential piece of our transportation network. And so should we, as we go forward, start thinking about integrating technology, internet connectivity, broadband, dark fiber into all of our thinking as being an essential component of transportation. Instead of physically going somewhere, we are digitally going somewhere, and it will be an important piece of our ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and spend less money on infrastructure if we can leverage what we do in that space. Just a comment.
Yeah, I would echo that comment. I think this is exactly that, an opportunity to think differently and imagine a different approach. And I'd encourage us to think about all these things in terms of where we invest, how we invest. Maybe we need to start investing in internet connectivity at a greater level. This will not be the last emergency setting we face, so it's important for those times that we may face going forward. But it's important for the reasons that you're suggesting, Commissioner Smith. We need to make internet connectivity a more reliable and pervasive way in which people live and work, so that we're not faced with people who can't do their jobs remotely when they'd like to, and it makes sense for us, or when we're asking them to, because they just can't. They don't have the ability to interface. So I think what I suggest is that we get an I realize, Assistant Director Brown, where we've got you in a situation where you're trying to figure it out, and we're asking a lot of questions around that, which is fine and healthy. But I'd like to see a report back to us, 60 to 90 days, that lays out what you've learned and what progress you're making on this, because I view this as potentially a big opportunity for all the reasons that the various members of the Commission have mentioned this morning, to really try and be transformative about how we work and think more comprehensively about how we invest, because we're obviously investing a lot of time in having offices. We just heard a minute ago, we get 60 DMV offices, for example. Maybe we need all 60 of those offices, but maybe we don't need everybody coming to them every day. And we're learning how to work through that to some degree. We're getting a backlog, but maybe there's a way to learn some lessons here that allow us to do this and not create a backlog. So just a lot of thinking to do, but I think it would be, I'm hearing the Commission is very interested in this to a person, and I suspect we'd all like to see progress report and what kind of planning, what kind of initiatives are going to be pursued by the department like us to consider authorizing if it comes to us, or that the director has already authorized. It's an area that hits a lot of the other areas we're focused on. And so I think we need to learn more about this and maybe have you come back to us in a few months, July, August, and provide an update.
Mr. Chair,
maybe at some point a proposal. Yeah, maybe an update and then eventually a proposal, because I think there's a lot here, I think, to explore.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair. Would be happy to, and I think that's certainly appropriate. We'll actually look forward to that. It'll help us as we drive a lot of this work internally. So be happy to bring that back. I would flag for you, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I have seen a flurry of text as this conversation was happening about potentially some connectivity issues. So if you're amenable, I might turn it over to Director Strickler. I think he might be tracking the latest.
Okay. Chair. Thank you. And thanks for the comments and questions by the Commission.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, it seems as though we have another network outage that is much broader than Odot, and it's impacting our ability to live stream, which will certainly impact our ability for the public to have access. So by way of, I think, trying to close up this topic and address any questions, I do want to make sure you have a chance to hear from Ms. Baker and Ms. Perkins, but maybe taking a short break after that, Mr. Chair, and then determining next steps. And my sincere apologies for the lack of redundancy right now, but the entire system, both phone and internet connectivity, are kind of tied into the same internet network outage.
Okay, well, let's hear from the two remaining members of the 4-member Assistant Director group, and then we'll take a break.
I just wanted to add, this is Commissioner Callery. The internet is down in the Bay Area.
Okay.
Interesting. Okay.
Well, Chris,
okay, Assistant Director Baker.
Should we stop? I don't think we should stop in mid-subject, so I would finish this one out and then take a break and come with you for a few minutes so when we take our break.
Yep, that would be perfect, Mr. Chair. Given that this item is informational and our decision item was actually still live streamed at the time, I think we are okay up to this point, but we may want to consider other remedies or potential postponement of other topics. But I think we can finish this topic with Ms. Baker and Ms. Perkins and then take that pause.
Okay.
Sounds good. Good morning, Mr. and Ms. Baker. I think it's kind of a surprise to you. I think the primary goal for the external relations has really been to distill all of the information that we've now been talking about for going on a half an hour and try to distill it down, communicate it out really clearly and effectively to the various stakeholders. So I think we have we've sort of established a website, which I think you all are aware of. We've been pushing out really regular communications, knowing that I think what is thematically consistent with this conversation, it is very much an evolving conversation. So I think we're trying to stay quite flexible and agile and nimble, knowing that there's a lot of questions that are coming at us from various places and people and points of inquiry, and we're trying to make sure that we're pushing that information out. So we have been staying very, very in close coordination with the governor's office, with DAS, with other various sort of state government response groups, I guess, for lack of a better term, and are staying in pretty close communication so that we what's going on with sort of counties and cities on the ground, what's happening at the ECC, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we've been sort of mostly successful, I would say, with that, and had continued to stay plugged into our sort of various stakeholder groups as well. I think last week we had a number of conversations with the Oregon Transportation Forum members. We continue to have ongoing conversations with our transit partners, with our construction partners as well, with law enforcement, as you all discussed earlier. And so really the theme is, let's stay in close coordination. Let's make sure that we're all sort of talking from the same sheet of music, and that we sort of are following along as things evolve at a quite rapid pace these days. So that's sort of what's happening on the communications front. I might sort of shift over now to what's happening in the legislative space, which perhaps won't be a surprise, but is even more in flux than anything else. So I think early on in the COVID sort of response, and this is the early to mid-March timeframe, there was a lot of conversation around the legislature coming into special session. I think as I may have mentioned to you all before, we were working in pretty close coordination with the governor's office and then the Joint Legislative Committee on Coronavirus Response, which is a special committee that was stood up specifically for COVID. That committee met a handful of times and sort of batted around different policy and sort of statutory changes and legislative actions that needed to be taken or could be taken. Ultimately, that sort of never materialized, and there was a lot of sort of focus on how to get the federal funds out as the federal package came out of Congress. So since that time, I think our conversations still remain quite live with the legislature and with the governor's office in particular. A lot of it has sort of, the legislature has now met an emergency board twice. Has met once, and then they have another meeting scheduled later this week. And really that's a lot of special appropriation and sort of funding, putting the federal funding out the door. After the May revenue forecast, which will happen on the 20th, so next week, I expect that the legislature will come into special session sometime after that. Again, this will likely be largely in the space of making budget changes to agencies, knowing that the budget shortfall and the budget gap across the state enterprise will be significant. Sort of simultaneously happening along those lines, the legislature regularly comes into interim legislative days, which you all are familiar with. their May legislative days were canceled this month, and instead they are now moving to sort of virtual meetings, which will happen towards the end part of the month and then the beginning of June. So Odot will be front and center, I think, for the Joint Committee on Transportation's interim meeting, which will happen in the beginning of June. And a lot of that conversation will focus on COVID response and what sort of the new normal is, how the system is impacted, what our response has been. DMV field offices, sort of the like, and very similar and consistent to this conversation as well. So I think to sort of wrap up, I would note that we just continue to stay in really close contact with one another. I think certainly internally to the organization, internal to state government, and then particularly with our external stakeholders as well, who all have very varied needs and questions, and trying to make sure that we are communicating as clearly and consistently as is possible, and sort of supporting the governor's office work as they move forward. So with that, I will pause and see if there's any questions.
Questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Lindsay.
Thank you. And I will now turn it over to Nakatris.
Good morning. For the record, this is Nakatris Perkins, Assistant Director for Social Equity. And so just real quickly, I know some of these things have already been alluded to in terms of the other Assistant Directors' reports, but zooming in on equity, we are thinking about community, city, state, and even global issues is always an opportunity, and I would argue even a responsibility to think about those that experience greater financial, health, social burdens based on the systemic reaction and marginalization of their identity, such as race or gender, income, ability. So whether that's historical or present day. So we're just looking to analyze the impacts of COVID-19 and what it looks like to reopen. We're asking questions that will allow us to best serve anyone who interfaces with us, and then hinging plans on those answers. So asking questions such as who's benefiting from our decisions, who are benefiting from our decisions, who's being hindered, are we forgetting or excluding people, and how are we being held accountable by those who are impacted? And asking those questions, there's going to undoubtedly be cases where inequity comes up in the answers, which will demand us to pivot. And so to use the question you asked, Chair, like thinking about over the next 60 to 90 days, where have we had to pivot and what have we learned from that will be something that we're looking at consistently, because it'll build a strong foundation for ODOT to develop an equity lens that we can apply agency-wide in planning and projects. So the impact of COVID-19 is devastating, right, globally, and it is creating an opportunity for us to really zoom in on what it looks like to best serve people, both internally and externally, so as a purveyor and as an employer. And so that's how we're looking at equity right now, as we think about reopening and the impact that COVID has already had on the people that we interface with on a daily basis.
Excellent. That's exactly what we are thinking about. Which is everyone, and the diversity of experience, and us being sensitive to that. So thank you for your comments, and thank you for being with us and providing that leadership. Comments or questions? Okay, well, it's 10:30, and I think we'll take a break. Let's take a 20-minute break. How's that sound, Chris? Is that enough? Not too much?
Mr. Chair, that sounds good, and we can circle back and determine next steps. I will get a call-in number to you to jump on a call with us so we can figure out next steps.
Okay, so 20-minute break, reconvene at 10:50. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
So I think it's my strong feeling, and I conferred with the director on this. So I think he shares this view that we should, in light of the fact that we don't have connectivity, and therefore we would be meeting for the balance of this agenda without an opportunity for the public and the media and others to be able to be involved, that I worry about. Well, I just think it's the right thing to do to delay the meeting, including because I think we could raise public meeting law issues. So my proposal, subject to comment by the commissioners and the director, is to adjourn the meeting for today. Notice a new meeting to be held as soon as we can schedule it, but within the next 2 weeks, to pick up where we've left off with the agenda and complete the agenda. We want to make sure that we provide sufficient notice for people to provide comment prior to the meeting, and to allow us and to find a time when all of us can be in attendance, including all those we need from Odot, in order to have this discussion. So that probably means a date week after next because of the notice provisions and the need to work with people's calendars. So that would be my proposal. And I guess I've just opened it up for comment. Does anyone feel differently?
Commissioner Smith here. I just could you give us a report on what the status of the connectivity issue might be?
Sure, I think Chris can do that.
Yeah, Commissioner, thank you for that. At this point, the status is still relatively unknown, frankly. So we've been able to, I think, provide some kind of streaming capacity. I think it's audio only on our Facebook site. But because, one, we haven't noticed it as such, and two, because we've been driving to the YouTube site, and right now the YouTube site isn't working, we believe that the connectivity issue likely has something to do with something that's more enterprise-wide and statewide than it does something within the Odot system. I hesitate to say affirmatively, though, because if I could say affirmatively, I'd have a better idea about the ability to carry on a meeting this afternoon. But I've got very limited confidence that we won't continue to have these issues throughout the remainder of the day.
Thank you. This is Commissioner Smith again. I agree. I think that we need to make sure that we are providing access to the community, and along those lines, I'd like us to really seriously look at more of an integrated platform for the next meeting, WebEx, Zoom, various things, so that we aren't trying to run two separate services at the same time. It may not have anything to do with our current problem, but I think that will help just logistically. That's my 2 cents.
I 100% agree with that.
Commissioner Callery?
I agree with that. The internet is back up in the Bay Area, but it appears to be intermittent.
Commissioner Brown?
I agree. I think that there are some other platforms. I do understand, though, it may be a challenge for ODOT to be able to use them, but I think we need to explore it at least.
Yeah, I agree, and we started to explore it, and then we've had some technical issues and availability issues, so we will get back on that. And I think we need to try it, even though it may have problems, because we have to assume we're going to be moving to more of these in the future if the predictions of many in the medical community are that we will potentially have a second wave of COVID. So for that reason alone, and there are other reasons, I think we should be moving to something different than what we've been using. So this may not be entirely the fault of trying to work these two systems that Commissioner Smith was alluding to, but I think I still think we're dealing with, there are better platforms out there, so we should be moving to one of them. So we'll work on that piece. Okay.
Mr. Chair, I think my only comment that I would, my apologies. My only comment would be, and part of this is just my lack of discrete knowledge around each of the platforms. My sense is that the real focus of our energies going forward should be certainly around the platform, and we can identify a platform that has some consistency. But I think it's also just redundancy and having multiple ways for the public to access, so that if one fails, which is pretty common in the IT space, then we have another option for carrying on the meeting. And so we'll research those at the same time.
Yeah, I agree with that. The redundancy is a really good idea. Well, I'm sorry this has turned out the way it has today, although I thought it was a good meeting, the part of it we had, and we'll get it rescheduled and move it ahead.
Sounds
So,
good. Thank you, everyone. This is
okay.
Oh, go ahead.
So
I'm sorry.
I'm going to hereby adjourn the meeting for today, and we'll schedule a subsequent meeting.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's what I was going to say. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.